I didn't fight back. I didn't send a strongly worded email. I didn't loop in HR or call a lawyer or leak anything to anyone. I just packed my badge into a small envelope, left it on the reception desk, and walked out the front door of Meridian BioLogics on a Tuesday morning in March. 48 hours later, the FDA placed the facility under a voluntary action indicated notice. Their lead manufacturing partner suspended shipment on $38 million in pending orders, and their biggest institutional client, a regional hospital network they'd been courting for 2 years, quietly pulled out of contract negotiations. I want to be very clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I did not plan any of that. I didn't pull strings or make calls or orchestrate anything. I just left, and the building fell down on its own. Let me back up. I spent 11 years at Meridian BioLogics. For people who don't know the industry, Meridian was a mid-sized pharmaceutical contract manufacturer based in New Jersey, the kind of company that doesn't make drugs you'd recognize by name, but makes the active ingredients that go into drugs you take every day. Unglamorous work, technically brutal, heavily regulated. I started there as a senior quality assurance specialist fresh out of a 6-year stretch at a larger firm in Pennsylvania, and over the course of a decade I worked my way up to Director of Quality Systems. My actual title by the end was Head of Regulatory Affairs and Quality Assurance, which sounds impressive, and also meant I was the person responsible for keeping us compliant with every FDA regulation, every ICH guideline, every GMP standard that applied to what we did. What that meant practically was this: my name was on the paperwork, not metaphorically, literally. Every batch record validation, every deviation report, every CAPA, corrective and preventive action, that went out the door, every FDA inspection response, my signature, my credentials, my personal license number as a registered pharmaceutical quality professional. This matters. I'll come back to it. The company I joined 11 years earlier was different from the company it became. In the early days, the founder was still involved. A pharmacist from Ohio named Walter who had started Meridian in the late 90s and built it on the principle that quality wasn't a department. It was a culture. He used to walk the production floor every morning. He knew the names of the line operators. He could tell you off the top of his head what our UWAS rate was for any given quarter. Walter retired about 4 years before all of this happened. The board brought in a new CEO, a woman named Ingrid, who had a background in healthcare private equity and had spent the previous 8 years running the operational side of a diagnostics company in Boston. She was sharp, polished, and completely out of her depth in pharmaceutical manufacturing, though she didn't know that yet. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. Ingrid's first all hands was about transformation. She used words like agility and right-sizing and modernizing our compliance infrastructure. She talked about legacy systems, and the way she said legacy, you could hear the contempt in it, like it was a polite word for dead weight. There were about 60 people in that conference room, many of whom had been at Meridian for over a decade. People who had built the systems she was calling legacy. I watched a few of them exchange glances. I kept my face neutral and took notes. She wasn't wrong that the company needed updating. Some of our documentation processes were genuinely outdated. Our QMS software was running on a platform that hadn't been updated since the Obama administration. There was real work to be done. The problem wasn't her agenda. The problem was how she planned to execute it, and specifically who she brought in to help. Her nephew's name was Jasper. He was 29 years old, had an MBA from a school in the Southeast that I'd never heard of, and had previously worked in supply chain logistics for a consumer goods company that made household cleaners. He had no pharmaceutical experience, no GMP training, no FDA regulatory background whatsoever. Ingrid introduced him at a leadership meeting 6 weeks into her tenure as our new Director of Operational Excellence, reporting directly to her. I remember exactly how she framed it. She said Jasper was bringing a fresh perspective, that sometimes the best thing you could do was bring in someone without preconceived notions about how things had to be done. She said the industry was changing, and they needed people who weren't locked into old ways of thinking. I looked at Jasper. He was nodding along with a kind of confident enthusiasm that suggested he had absorbed about 40% of what she'd just said about his own role. He was wearing a suit that was slightly too big for him. I didn't say anything, not then. Over the next few months, Jasper started inserting himself into every operational meeting, including quality and regulatory discussions he had no business being in. He had ideas, lots of ideas. He wanted to streamline our batch record system, which he described as unnecessarily complex. He wanted to digitize our deviation tracking in a way that would, if implemented as he described, have eliminated several controls that were legally required under 21 CFR Part 211. He used the phrase, "automation can handle it a lot," which told me he'd been reading articles about Pharmaceutical 4.0 without understanding what any of it actually required in practice. I raised these concerns in writing, twice, once in a meeting, once in a formal memo to Ingrid copied to our Chief Operating Officer. I was polite but specific. I cited the relevant regulations by number. I explained what the exposure was. Ingrid thanked me for my thoroughness and said she'd have Jasper review my concerns. Jasper then sent me a response that, and I am not exaggerating, used the phrase, "I think we can be more nimble here." I understood then that my concerns were not going to be engaged with seriously. They were going to be managed. Around the same time, I started noticing other things. My calendar invites to certain planning meetings stopped coming. A project I had been leading, a requalification of our cleanroom environmental monitoring program, a 6-month process I'd been shepherding since before Ingrid arrived, was quietly reassigned to Jasper's team without any conversation with me. When I asked about it, Ingrid said she wanted to give Jasper's team a chance to develop their capabilities and that she was sure I had plenty on my plate. I did have plenty on my plate. I had 3 ongoing FDA responses, 2 supplier qualification audits, and a pre-approval inspection coming up for a new product line in Q3. The cleanroom project wasn't removed because I was overwhelmed. It was removed because it was high visibility and she wanted Jasper to have a win. I started keeping records. Not because I was planning anything. I just have a habit, from years in regulatory affairs, of documenting. When something feels off, you write it down. Date, time, what was said, who was in the room. You keep emails. You save meeting notes. It's muscle memory at this point. I have filing systems the way other people have anxiety tics. I documented the meeting where Jasper proposed a batch release protocol that would have violated FDA guidance. I documented the memo I sent. I documented Ingrid's non-response. I documented Ingrid's non-response. I documented the date my cleanroom project was reassigned and the fact that no one told me directly. I documented the 3 conversations where my input in regulatory planning meetings was interrupted, redirected, or simply not acknowledged. None of this was dramatic. It didn't feel like preparing for something. It just felt like staying sane. The thing that finally clarified everything for me happened on a Thursday in February, about 9 months after Ingrid joined. She called me into her office, just the 2 of us, and told me that she was restructuring the quality and regulatory function. She was creating a new combined role, she said, that would report to Jasper rather than directly to the COO. The role would have a broader scope, she said, which in my experience is something people say when they're reducing your authority and want to dress it up. She said she thought I might find the new structure freeing. That word, freeing. She used it without irony. I asked one question. I asked whether the person in this new role would still be the signatory of record on our FDA submissions and batch release documentation. She said she was still working through the details, but the intention was to distribute those responsibilities more broadly. I let that sit for a moment. Then I asked her whether she'd discussed this restructuring with our regulatory counsel. She said she had it covered. I said I see, and I thanked her for letting me know, and I went back to my office and closed the door. Here is what she didn't understand, and what I should probably explain clearly for anyone who doesn't work in pharmaceutical manufacturing. A regulatory signatory in a drug manufacturing facility isn't just a title. It's a legal designation under FDA regulations, specifically 21 CFR Part 211 and the associated guidance documents. Certain functions must be performed or directly supervised by qualified individuals whose credentials and responsibilities are formally documented with the agency. Batch release, QA oversight, deviation disposition. These aren't functions you can distribute broadly by updating an org chart. I had been the named quality designee on 7 active drug master files. I was the responsible official on 2 FDA establishment registrations. My credentials and role had been formally reviewed by FDA inspectors during our last 3 facility audits. In 2 cases, I had been explicitly cited by name in FDA correspondence as the point of contact for ongoing inspection commitments. If I left, those designations didn't transfer automatically. Someone would need to be nominated, qualified, and in some cases, formally accepted by the agency before they could assume those functions. That process doesn't happen in a week. It barely happens in 3 months. And that's if everything goes smoothly and the agency is responsive. Jasper had none of the required qualifications, not even close. I spent about 2 weeks after that meeting thinking. I called a friend from my Pennsylvania days, a woman who'd left pharma to do regulatory consulting, and talked through the situation without identifying the company. She confirmed what I already knew. She also said, gently, that situations like this tend to resolve themselves one way or another, and that the important thing was to make sure I wasn't holding the bag when they did. I put in my resignation on a Monday. 2 weeks' notice, professionally worded, no drama. I cited personal career development. I thanked Ingrid for the opportunity. I offered to assist with transition planning. In the 2 weeks before my last day, I did everything correctly. I prepared a thorough transition document outlining all open regulatory commitments, all pending FDA interactions, all active DMF and establishment registration obligations. I flagged every designation that would need to be reassigned and outlined the steps required to do so properly. I sent it to Ingrid, the COO, and our regulatory counsel. I did this, not as a gesture, not as a performance. I did it because it was my professional obligation, and because if anything went wrong later, I wanted it on record that I had told them exactly what needed to happen. Ingrid's response was brief. She thanked me, said the team had it covered, and reminded me to complete my offboarding checklist before my final day. On my last day, I turned in my badge, completed my offboarding, said goodbye to the people I'd worked alongside for 11 years, and walked out. That was a Tuesday. On Thursday, 2 days later, I got a call from our former regulatory counsel. Not Meridian's counsel anymore, I should say. She had quietly left the company a few months earlier, which I hadn't known. She told me she'd been reached out to by the FDA district office. They'd received notification that I was no longer with the company and were inquiring about the status of several open commitments, including an ongoing response to a warning letter observation that I had been managing. I hadn't known there was a warning letter. That told me something had happened after I left, or possibly just before, that Ingrid hadn't told me about. I told the former counsel I had submitted a full transition document, copied her on it, and that I no longer had any legal standing with the company. She said she understood. She also said, quietly, that things were moving quickly over there, and that she'd wanted to make sure I was aware. I thanked her and hung up. Over the next several weeks, I heard things, not from anyone inside Meridian. I had no contact with anyone there, but from people in the industry, because pharmaceutical manufacturing in New Jersey is not a large world and people talk. What I heard was this. Meridian had tried to reassign my regulatory designations internally to someone on Jasper's team, a person with a quality background in food manufacturing, not pharmaceuticals. The FDA district office had not accepted this reassignment as adequate and had issued a request for additional qualification documentation. While this was pending, Meridian's ability to release new commercial batches was technically in question, which created a problem for their manufacturing partner commitments. The hospital network that had been in contract negotiations, a large regional system that would have represented Meridian's largest commercial relationship by revenue, received word from their procurement team that Meridian was currently under a regulatory review status that required additional due diligence before any supply agreement could be finalized. The procurement team, being a hospital system procurement team, decided additional due diligence meant waiting. The wait turned into a withdrawal. The $38 million in pending orders from their existing manufacturing partners didn't all get canceled, but a significant portion was put on hold pending regulatory clarity, which in pharmaceutical supply chain terms is functionally the same as canceled for the quarter. I learned later that Jasper was removed from his operational excellence role about 4 months after I left. I don't know if Ingrid is still there. I don't have any wish for her to fail personally. I hope Meridian eventually got their house in order, because people take the drugs that come out of facilities like that, and quality in pharmaceutical manufacturing isn't abstract. But I'll tell you this. When people ask me what I did to make all of that happen, I tell them the honest answer, which is nothing. I showed up for 11 years. I built systems that worked. I kept documentation that was accurate. I told the people responsible what the risks were twice in writing. And then when they made clear they didn't want what I had to offer, I left. The systems I had built didn't stop working just because I wasn't there anymore. The regulations I had been managing didn't stop existing. The designations that had my name on them didn't transfer by wishful thinking. I didn't collapse anything. It was already load-bearing. They just didn't know it until they tried to move the wall. I was consulting independently within 6 weeks of leaving. My first client was a startup in the cell therapy space that had just received their IND and needed someone to build their quality management system from scratch. Real work, interesting problems, nobody's nephew in any of the meetings. The thing I think about sometimes, not with satisfaction, just as a matter of fact, is that warning letter response I had been managing. I had been 3 weeks from closing it. 3 weeks. 11 years of work. And they couldn't wait 3 more weeks to figure out the org chart. That's the part that still gets me. Not the money, not the titles, not the restructuring. Just the 3 weeks. Some lessons you learn from reading. Some you learn from watching someone else make the mistake. And some you only understand when the FDA calls and asks who's responsible now, and there's no one in the building who can answer the question. I could have answered it. For 11 years, I always could. The thing I keep coming back to isn't the money. It isn't the FDA notice or the hospital network walking away or any of the numbers that got thrown around after I left. It's a much smaller thing, I had told them. Twice. In writing. With regulation numbers. And they thanked me for my thoroughness and sent Jasper to respond. That's the part that teaches you something real about how consequences work. Not that bad people get punished eventually. That's too clean and too simple and often not even true. But that reality has its own accounting system. And it doesn't care about org charts. The batch records I signed didn't become less legally significant because someone drew a new reporting line. The FDA designations with my name on them didn't transfer because a PowerPoint said broader distribution of responsibilities. You can restructure around knowledge all you want. The knowledge doesn't restructure with you. I think about Walter a lot, actually. The founder, the pharmacist from Ohio who walked the production floor every morning. He built something that worked because he respected what he didn't know. He didn't pretend that enthusiasm was a substitute for expertise or that an MBA from anywhere was equivalent to a decade of GMP audits. That kind of intellectual honesty. The willingness to look at a system you didn't build and ask, what am I missing before you start dismantling it? That's not humility as a personality trait. It's practical intelligence. It's the difference between leading something and just occupying the title. Ingrid wasn't a bad person. I want to be clear about that. She was smart, she was driven, and she had a genuine vision for what the company could become. What she lacked wasn't talent. It was the discipline to sit with what she didn't understand before she started moving pieces around. Jasper wasn't malicious either. He was 29 and given authority he hadn't earned, which is a situation that tends to go badly regardless of the individual's intentions. The failure wasn't personal. It was structural. And I'd seen it coming from the moment she used the word legacy, like it was something to be ashamed of. What I know now, after consulting independently for the better part of a year, is that the work I did at Meridian for 11 years wasn't about loyalty to a company. It was about integrity toward a function. I showed up every day and signed my name to things because I believed those systems mattered, not because someone was watching, not because it served my career in any obvious way, but because pharmaceutical quality is one of those fields where cutting corners eventually lands on a real person. That belief didn't waver when Ingrid restructured around me. It didn't waver when Jasper sent me a memo about being more nimble. And it didn't waver when I sat down to write the transition document that outlined every single open commitment they'd need to manage after I left. That document was the thing I'm most proud of in this whole story. Not because it triggered anything, I don't think it did, not directly, but because it was the last act of someone who had done the work honestly and refused to stop doing it honestly just because the situation had turned ugly. You carry that with you. The choices you make when no one is rewarding you for making them correctly, those are the ones that actually define what you're made of. I don't know what became of Ingrid or Jasper in the long run. I hope they figured it out. I hope Meridian got back into compliance and kept making the ingredients that go into the medications people depend on. That matters more to me than any of the rest of it. What I took away from all of it is simpler than people might expect. Know your craft deeply enough that you can explain exactly what breaks if you leave. Do the work well enough that the work itself is the argument. And when the people above you refuse to engage with what you know, not because they disagree, but because engaging would be inconvenient for a decision they've already made, have enough self-respect to stop carrying the weight of a structure that doesn't want to hold itself up. The FDA called 2 days after I left. There was no one there to answer. I could have answered for 11 years. I always could.